The crowd that day was thick and it was close. Everyone was gathering around. Everyone was straining to see. We were all very starstruck. Word of Jesus, the healer, the miracle worker, a holy man, had spread throughout our village. And Jesus had just returned from the other side of the lake. And the minute he stepped out of the boat onto the shore, the crowd was already there, waiting for him, hoping to catch a glimpse of the next miraculous thing that he might do. And it's the kind of crowd that is so thick and so determined that you just get swept up in it and carried along with it. And perhaps when you hear the story of Jesus' miraculous deeds, you might wanted to have been in the crowd that day, eager to see Jesus in person, eager to experience what it would have been like to be around him and swept up in the momentum of the crowds who adored him and were amazed by everything that he did. However, if you learned that I was in the crowd that day, maybe you would have stayed home. Now, I didn't anticipate how thick the crowd would be. I didn't realize how it would be so that you could barely move except to follow the way that everyone was going, the constant touching and close contact with total strangers. If I had known how thick the crowd would have been, would I have stayed home? Probably not, to be honest. By every right, I should not have been out in that crowd. Everyone I came into contact that day, even by accident, was rendered unclean by our laws. Not sinful, you must know, but unclean. How many people did I touch that day? How many people brushed into me? A few dozen? 100 even? It was that thick of a crowd. And my condition dictated that I shouldn't be out in it. But I was through letting the condition that I was in dictate the story of my life. Now, my illness had started 12 years before that. Yes, 12 years. But it was more than just the physical problem that I had, the pain and the weakness from blood loss and the inconvenience and the extra planning that was always required to go anywhere or do anything. Of course, all those things were difficult. But the problem was so much more than that. You see, in my society, a woman was valued primarily for the ways in which she can contribute as a wife and as a mother. And for 12 years, I could be neither of those things. I was not able to have a husband, and I was not able to be a wife, and so I couldn't conceive a child. And so I never knew the joy of being a mother. And in our culture, we say the life is in the blood. And so by this logic, life had been seeping out of me, draining away, sometimes slowly, at other times quickly, but always steadily, for 12 years. There were so many things that I longed to do that other women could do so easily. They could do it almost without effort, it seemed, and I could not do those things. Some days I was so weak I couldn't even do the simplest task in my household, and so I was a burden, a drain. And I was alone. I had no male sponsor to speak up for me, no one to go into the crowd for me that day. I was alone because I had no husband due to my condition. I lived in the household of one of my brothers, but he tired of dealing with my condition years ago. And my whole family felt the same. When things first started, my family cared and they tried to help. And my father dragged me to one doctor after another, and he spent lots of money in the process, but nothing helped. And after a couple of years of this, of the hope that maybe this next healer would somehow be different, that he would have a different technique, that he would have come across a miracle powder, that he would know what was going on in the first place, That hope would build up, and then I would just be disappointed when the serum was gone and the applications ran out, or the techniques they gave us were tried, and my condition was no better. Over the years, despite running after every rumor of a doctor or healer that we could find, things did not improve at all. And in fact, they got worse. And then my father passed away, and I started out living with one brother and then another brother until they all tired of me and suggested that maybe it was time for someone else in the family to take over the duty that they had. My brothers resented the money that my father had spent on looking for a cure for me, money that would have gone to them in an inheritance if the family coffers had not been drained in this fruitless seeking after a cure. I was of no value to them. I could not be married off in my condition, obviously, and so they didn't have any hope of losing the extra mouth that was in their household to feed. And because they were family, they treated me kindly enough, and they didn't usually say things like this in my presence. But I knew that I was a burden. I knew that others were forced to support me, that I didn't and I couldn't ever contribute to a household or to society in any meaningful way. My brothers stopped funding the search for a cure when my father passed away, and I don't blame them. They had their own families to worry about, their own daughters' dowries to save for, their own sons to nurture, their own wives to comfort. And I, of course, didn't have much, but when I could save a few coins here or there, I continued the search for a cure on my own, venturing further and further outside the realm of accepted or normal doctors, looking for anyone who promised a cure of any kind. But the trend continued. Nothing helped, and things got slowly and steadily and progressively worse. Now, in addition to not being permitted to go out in a crowd and to living in the margins of my brother's household and never being able to contribute, in addition to never having a husband or a child of my own, and to suffering pain and weakness that other people didn't really understand, there was the added pain of never being able to go to the temple to worship God. I had fond memories as a child in the years before my condition occurred of going to the house of the Lord and worshiping God with the others who were there and loved to worship him too. But now I was not allowed to enter into the temple gates due to my impurity. And so the spiritual void that I felt was almost as keen as the physical weakness. Maybe some of you know all too well the ways in which illness or disability or other conditions can affect your life in ways that are so much deeper than just physical pain. Maybe you know that suffering of any kind can produce isolation from all of the things and the people that you know and love. Maybe you know how even an invisible wound or invisible suffering can change you in ways that you never imagined. Maybe you know how it is to long to do something that everyone else seems to be able to do very easily and you simply cannot do it. Maybe you carry that burden around inside you. And if that's so, I know, because I've been there. And so rumors surfaced in my village of another healer, another holy man who had come into our region and who had laid his hands on sick people and who had healed them. And I know that if my father had been there, he would have marched up to the man himself and asked him to come and lay hands on me. Just like the little girl whose father, our synagogue leader named Jairus, had come and fell at Jesus' feet seeking a cure for his daughter that day, my father would have done the same thing. If I'd had a male representative who had not given up on me, then I would not have to have been out in the crowd that day. But that is not the way that my story goes. I'm not sure why I thought that this particular healer would be any different than the last one or the last 100 doctors that I had seen. Maybe it was because he'd already laid hands on someone from my village, that someone had taken their sick mother to him, and that when he touched her, the fever left her. I don't know what gave me hope to be out in the crowd that day, the determination to go out and seek out this healer. I can't call it courage. I had none of that left anymore. And I went out in the crowd and I wanted to find the healer, yes, but I was going to remain anonymous. I was so tired of hoping, of explaining my situation. I was so tired of having the promise of a cure built up and then never having that promise delivered on, that I didn't think I could face talking to even one more healer about it. But still, there was something here, something powerful, something holy even, so much that I felt drawn to him that day. And it certainly wasn't hard to find where he was with the crowds thronging about, but it was very hard to get close to him because something was going on. Jesus had just returned and the crowds were in quite a stir. And although I was focused only on getting close to him, darting in and out through the smallest holes and the spaces in the crowd, I didn't quite realize that there was another celebrity in our midst. Another person was there that day too, desperately seeking healing, not for himself, but for his daughter, his 12-year-old daughter. I had been sick as long as this little girl had been alive. But at the time, I knew very little of what else was going on. If I heard this man addressing Jesus and begging him to come heal his little girl, it didn't register in my mind. My focus was on getting to him first, before he could run away, before he could find his way into a house where I could not get to him, and after which I may never see him again. Who knows if he'd ever come back to our little village? He was pretty important. He was popular and sought after by all. And so I continued to press and to slide and to push my way through the crowd, closer, ever closer to him. And finally, I was so close that I could hear his voice, and I could see his head, and I could see his hair. And then there it was, right in front of me, the edge of his robe. And someone pushed me to the side, and I almost lost my proximity to him. And so I saw my opportunity, and I seized it. I ducked down, and I reached out, and I grabbed the tassel of his robe. To me, that was the safest thing that I could have done. If he had power, as he seemed to, then maybe just touching his clothing would heal me. And if he didn't have power, if he was just another disappointment, well then, I had lost nothing. Not this time. I could just slink away into the crowd the way that I came, and no one would be any the wiser for it. And so there was his robe in front of me, and I touched it. And I couldn't believe what happened when I did. I had barely dared to hope that a touch could heal me, but the instant I felt the strings in my fingers, I felt the change. Something was different. That flow that I had experienced for so long, that had been my unwanted and unwelcome companion for 12 years, was suddenly dried up. And I knew deep in my bones that I was healed. I was cured. After 12 years of searching and suffering and hoping and then having my hopes dashed, I finally received my miracle. And so I turned to go. Wouldn't my brother be thrilled? I was so excited by the possibilities that awaited me. I could help out around the house. I could be purified. I could go to the temple, and my life could get back on track. And I suddenly wished that my father could be there to see that I had been healed and to share this moment with me. And I was still standing there in the thick of the crowd just as I had been minutes before, but nothing at all was the same. And a million thoughts were racing through my head all at once, but then his voice pierced them. "Who touched me?" the voice said. And I turned around to see the healer, his eyes raking through the crowds, searching out mine. And my heart leapt into my throat. I was terrified. Before, I was just another face in the crowd, and that's how I wanted to stay. I didn't want anyone there finding out about my condition, finding out how an unclean woman had ventured out alone into a crowd where she shouldn't have been. What would they do to me when they found out? What would he do to me? And the men closest to Jesus, the ones who I knew were his disciples, bought me a reprieve from his searching eyes. Incredulously, they looked around at the crowd pressing in all around him and said, "You can see the people crowding against you, and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" And so in that moment, I turned around once again to go, to fade away so that no one would have to see, so that no one else would know what I'd done. But something held me there. Fear, perhaps, or maybe something else. Maybe it was whatever had drawn me to him in the first place. And Jesus didn't listen to his disciples' incredulous questioning. He kept on searching the crowd. The eyes were piercing and seeking and looking. And suddenly I knew what I had to do. I was trembling with fear. I didn't know what would happen. Would the crowd turn on me? Would the crowd turn on him? Would the synagogue leader, that important man who'd asked Jesus to come and heal his daughter and was growing ever more impatient at the delay caused as Jesus stopped and looked through the crowd for me, would he be angry at me? If I had acted inappropriately, sneaking up behind Jesus rather than talking to his face, I should not have even been out in that crowd as well at all. But still, I knew I had to come forward. I'd just gotten my life back, and now the possibility loomed that it would be taken from me. But still, I had no choice. And I fell down before Jesus, right at his feet, and I told him the whole truth. The whole unvarnished truth. Not just about what happened that day, about how I'd snuck up behind him and touched his robe. I told him the truth about my last 12 years, about the illness that had broken my body, my social life, my family, even my spirit, about the pain and about the isolation and about all those things that I wanted to do but never could. I told him about the visits to the doctors and the constant hope that things would get better, and then things never did. I told him about the money that was wasted, gone, never to get back, which had driven my father to the brink of insolvency. I told him the whole truth. My story tumbled out of me, word upon word, and I couldn't stop talking. And when I was finally finished, I waited for a moment, afraid of his response. I didn't even want to look up. But when I did, I realized that I was looking into the most compassionate gaze that I had ever seen. I expected a lot of things might happen. Anger, perhaps, that I, an unclean woman, had touched this holy man, not to mention countless others in the crowd, and rendered him unclean as well. Maybe he would scold me for the delay while he was carrying out his very important mission. After all, a little girl's life hung in the balance that day, and certainly my chronic illness could have waited one more day to be healed. Or maybe he would have said that it was wrong for me not to ask him for a healing, that I lacked the courage to come before him face to face and request healing instead of sneaking up behind him and stealing it away. Maybe he would even take it away. He would rescind my healing once he saw how unworthy and how poor and how broken and how undeserving I was. The very last thing that I expected was compassion. But there it was, written all over his face. Did I even detect a smile? That was certainly too much to hope for. And I never could have anticipated what happened next. The man with the compassionate eyes said, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be free from your suffering." My faith healed me? Not I have healed you, but your faith has healed you, he said. And much later on, I learned that Jesus never tells his disciples they have enough faith. But me, the woman who had been driven to steal a miracle anonymously out of desperation, he said that I had the kind of faith that healed. But even more amazing than all of this, he called me daughter. Me, who had lost her father on earth, who had lost her advocate and her protector, who'd lost the one who spoke for me and cared most for me in this world. And because of my illness, I'd even lost contact with my Father in heaven because I'd been unable to set foot in a temple or a synagogue to worship him for 12 years. There was another sick little girl waiting on her deathbed, but her father was anxiously tapping his foot, having come to Jesus himself to procure a miracle for her, and I had no one. But now that was no longer true. Now I belonged to Jesus. Now I was his daughter. My body was healed from the power that went out from him when I touched his cloak. But the encounter with Jesus, this I now feel is what really changed me and what really made a difference in my life. The encounter with Jesus is what saved me and made me whole. You see, I was healed that day, but I will still grow old, and one day I will die. And even the little girl who did not die that day will grow up and will witness much sadness in her lifetime, and one day she too will leave the earth. We both received healing that day, but it was temporary at best. But what matters even more than the healing was the encounter. What matters is that I heard Jesus call me his daughter. And knowing that I belonged to Jesus, that's what made me whole that day. That is what made all the difference. Now I had a father. A father who could heal, yes, but it was more than that. I had a father to whom I told the whole truth. Everything about my life he knew. And instead of being angry or disappointed or upset, he called me his daughter. Now, maybe you have a tale to tell. Maybe you've suffered physically, or maybe you suffer in other ways, spiritually, emotionally, socially. Have you ever wanted to hide the truth about yourself from someone else? Have you ever wanted to hide the truth about yourself from God? What would happen if you came to God just as you are? When you are at the end of your rope, as I certainly was that day, and as Jairus and his daughter were that day as well, what would happen if when you got to the end of your rope, you went to God? What would happen if you told him the whole truth about your sin or about your suffering or about your pain? And what if, instead of trying to make it better on your own, trying whatever worldly things you can find to numb the pain, whatever it is out there that promises relief but never makes things better, what if you committed instead to telling the whole truth about yourself to God? What prevents you from doing this? Fear? Worry? A feeling of brokenness? A feeling of unworthiness, perhaps? I can tell you that if there is anyone in the world who was broken that day, it was me, who had felt the life seep out of me for 12 years. And if there is anyone in that crowd who was unlovable, it was me. No one would have known, no one would have cared if I left that day unchanged, still bound by my illness. If there is anyone who was unworthy, it was me. Breaking all social convention to sneak up behind this healer in a crowd and potentially steal a miracle from a little girl who was running out of time, lying in her bed nearing death. And yet it turned out that there was enough time and enough power and enough compassion and enough grace to go around and to heal even me. I didn't have much courage that day when I came to Jesus. I couldn't even ask him for a miracle to his face. But when Jesus saw me, he called me daughter. Even though he knew the whole truth about me, he still wanted me as his daughter. And because of this, I left him a different person. I left him healed, and I left him whole. What stops you from telling the whole truth about yourself to God? What stops you from having your own encounter with Jesus? Would you pray with me? Our loving God, we thank you so much that you know the whole truth about each and every one of us, and yet you still love us anyway. We thank you that there is nothing in all our lives that you do not see, no pain that we feel that you don't also feel, no worry that we have that you do not share. We pray for the courage to be honest with you about all of our struggles, all of our illnesses, all of our pain, all of the truth about our lives. And no matter where we are in our lives, may we also hear you call us your son or your daughter. May we have the courage to believe that faith in you can heal us. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.